I've had my share of odd jobs over the years. My first gig was a summer job at 16, working on a dairy farm during the break. I absolutely despised it there. It drained every ounce of motivation I had to even think about finding work again, afterward. I can't quite recall how I stumbled into that job, but the next summer I landed a role as an office assistant for a self-employed photographer named Elowen. My parents knew her from way back when she was part of their church, and my sister had been in her 4-H program before she shut it down. By the time I started, Elowen's health was on a downward spiral. She blamed it on a mix of chronic Lyme disease and fibromyalgia. My folks had warned me she was a bit eccentric. She was deeply religious, claiming she'd had genuine run-ins with demons and had even taken part in a few exorcisms. I'm an atheist and a hardcore skeptic, so I never bought into her tales. Beyond the weird stories she'd share, she was mostly harmless, and the job itself was a breeze. It mainly involved data entry, plus some light photo prep, touching up images and adding her company watermark before uploading them to a site where clients could browse and order prints. She specialized in horse events, dressage, stadium jumping, and cross-country. For the first few months, I worked out of her living room, which doubled as my office. Eventually, she convinced me to tag along to the shows where she trained me to shoot photos. Soon enough, I was capturing events alongside her. It was dull work, honestly. I'm no horse enthusiast. But things didn't get strange until about a year in, when I realized it wasn't Elowen I needed to watch out for. She had 2 sons. One lived out of state and the other, Torin, was in the Navy. I'd only heard bits and pieces about Torin. He was somewhere on the autism spectrum, though Elowen was vague about his exact diagnosis. She was adamant he'd been vaccine injured, pinning all his quirks on that. When he finally came home, I met him while working in her living room. He seemed decent enough at first, a little awkward, but nothing alarming. He was obsessed with movies, and since I'm a bit of a film nerd myself, he'd wander in and chat about whatever we were watching or excited to see. I should mention I was just 18 then, while he was in his mid-30s. Somewhere along the line, he got it into his head that I was into him. He never said it to my face, but I found out through my parents. My mom was a secretary at their church, and Torin knew it. Elowen must have told him. One afternoon, he showed up at her desk, gushing about me. How much fun I was, how he loved our talks, how he planned to take me to the movies and his church, all these grand ideas he had. My mom was beyond uneasy, and so was the pastor who overheard. That night, she told me everything and suggested I be careful not to give him the wrong idea. I was floored. I hadn't done a thing to suggest interest. We'd never even talked about hanging out. Things got creepier when I overheard him talking to Elowen in the next room. He was recounting his Navy days while she ranted about the evils of Islam. At one point he said, dead serious, "If I had my way, I'd just shoot and kill any Muslim I met. Problem solved." She laughed it off like it was nothing, but his tone chilled me to the bone. I started keeping my distance, giving him short answers and stressing I had work to do whenever he was around. Eventually, he got his own place and moved out, so I figured the issue had sorted itself out. A couple of years later, I'd moved out too. Elowen's business had folded, and I was at a new job. I was still friends with both her and Torin on Facebook. Around that time, I came out as an atheist, something I couldn't do while living at home. One night, Elowen messaged me about a ring I wore, black with a white star and a black circle. Knowing where she was headed, I told her it was just a ring. She accused me of wearing a pentagram and promoting Satan. I tried explaining it wasn't that symbol and that paganism has nothing to do with Satan anyway, but she wouldn't hear it. I let it drop. Typical Elowen, not worth the fight. The next morning, Torin messaged me insisting I come to his church. I said no, and his replies turned furious. He went from asking to demanding, calling me lost, saying I'd never find answers living like this. He eventually snapped that my pentagram was disgusting and inviting possession. Seeing no point in arguing with him any more than with his mom, I blocked them both, done with the pair. Then he started showing up at my workplace. He'd scour the store until he found me, corner me, and talk non-stop, ignoring my attempts to brush him off or say I had to work. My managers caught on and began intercepting him. I wasn't earning enough there to cover rent, so I took a second job in another town. Within a week, he showed up there too. I told the managers who he was, and after that, I'd hide in the back room behind a locked door while they rushed his order and got him out. During one of those run-ins while I hid, a manager was with me punching in time cards. We both heard Torrin shouting toward us, "I know you remember me." That was it for them. They banned him from the place. He stopped showing up at my other job too, which was a relief. Years passed, and I got used to not checking over my shoulder every shift or scanning parking lots for his truck. Then one day he reappeared. I was walking past a section at work when he spotted me, wide-eyed like a deer in headlights. I bolted to the break room. His presence alone freaked me out. After that, he started coming regularly. I'd dodge him, but he'd still catch sight of me eventually. I debated telling the managers, but since he hadn't done anything lately, it felt petty to report him just for making me nervous. Call me a coward or a fool. That's where my head was at. I regretted not speaking up when one night he caught me at the customer service desk. He said hi, and I started looking for someone to signal so I could slip away. Before I could, he said something that made my stomach drop. "How's your little girl doing? She's 3 now, right?" I stared at him, horrified. I'd blocked him from all my social media, his number too. I'd moved to a new address and hadn't spoken to him or Elowen since the ring drama. Neither knew I was married or a parent. I wasn't connected to anyone who knew them. "How's your husband doing?" he pressed when I didn't respond. "He's good, he's a good man," I said, trying to shut it down and make it clear I wanted nothing to do with him. "Really? Where does he work?" I felt faint. Thankfully, another employee came by to grab some shelves, and I escaped. As I left, he called after me, "I'll see you again. We'll talk a lot and do something together, we will." I reported it to the managers, spilling everything. How he knew details about my family he shouldn't. They pulled his face from CCTV. I haven't heard anything since, so I assume someone confronted him because he hasn't shown up again. This has dragged on for 10 years, and I just want it over. If he comes back, I'm calling the police. I'm seriously hoping it never comes to that. I just need him to stop. A couple of years ago, I was deep into skating. I didn't have many friends to hit the park with, so I was always scoping out new people to skate alongside. One day, I met this really friendly guy named Lorcan at the skate park. He seemed super keen on making new friends and maybe even building a little skate crew. He was obsessed with grabbing clips and photos to throw up on social media, which I thought was pretty cool. We clicked. He was easygoing and fun, so I figured, why not team up with a new skate pal? I gave him my number, and at first, everything seemed totally normal. A few days later, he texted me to hang out. I picked him up and we skated all day. He was still the same chill, driven guy, no odd vibes or anything. I dropped him off after, and it all felt good. Then, a couple of days later, while I was at school, he texted asking if I wanted to skate. I was busy and didn't reply right away. Within an hour, my phone started blowing up with messages from him. "Why aren't you answering me? What did I do? I'm sorry." I said, "Screw it." And that night, I asked him to skate again. I know that sounds stupid, but he'd been So normal before that I thought maybe he was just on the spectrum or something. Even if it seemed dicey to keep hanging out, that day was fine too. Just the same friendly, motivated guy I'd met. But after I dropped him off, things got weird. A few days later, it happened again. He texted, I got busy, and he freaked out because I didn't respond. This time, I didn't reply at all that day or night, and that set him off even more. Over. The next week, he sent me hundreds of texts, going from this aggressive, clingy vibe to straight-up delusional. We'd met when I was 19, but he started texting crazy stuff like, remember when we were kids and you'd come over? We'd hang out, you'd have your shirt off, and we'd play. I felt bad for him. I knew he was a good guy at heart, just dealing with some serious mental baggage. I wished he had more people around to help him handle it. Later, he started calling me over and over. I've got hundreds of voicemails from him. And the creepiest thing is they're all silent. He'd call my phone and just sit there, leaving. These long messages where I could hear him breathing or a fan humming in the background. This went on for a few months at first. I thought he might have lost my number or forgotten about me, but then, a few months after it quieted down, he started calling again. This time from an unknown number, so I couldn't block him. It went on like that, off and on for about a year. There was one time someone came to the house, got through our gate, and trashed our front yard. We're not sure if it was Lorcan or not, but after that, we put up cameras. That was the worst it got for a while. Mostly he just kept calling. One time he used what I think was his mom's phone. A text came through saying, "This is Lorcan's mom. Just wants to know why he won't talk to him back." Then right after he texted from his own number, "Don't bother my mom." It all died down about a year ago. I'm not sure what happened to him, but I hope he got the help he needs and is doing okay. This story kicks off with my sister in 8th grade and stretches all the way to today, so when I say it's long, I mean long. My sister, Seren, is 6 years younger than me. I was born overseas and moved to the US with my family when I was 2. She was the first of us born here. When she was in 8th grade, I was in college, but our family's tight-knit, so I'd visit home a lot and talk on the phone often. I didn't see what went down firsthand, but my mom, dad, and Seren filled me in. Serene's always been one of those pretty girls who lives for male attention even back then. She was hyper-aware of how she looked, how guys saw her, and she was dead set on landing a boyfriend. That boyfriend turned out to be a high school freshman named Cillian. Around here, a 1-year age gap in relationships wasn't unusual. I'd dated a freshman myself in 8th grade, so when Seren locked onto him, she got a little obsessed with the idea, probably because he was in high school and she was still in middle school. When Cillian didn't want to date her, he still kept her dangling with just enough attention, phone calls, meeting up in her friend's neighborhood where he lived, to keep her hooked without committing. It might not sound like much, but it really messed with her head. Young, hormonal, and dealing with what we now know was manic depression, she cared way too much about what people, especially guys, thought of her. So she started cutting, sneaking out, and turning hostile toward us at home. Sure, some of it was her being spoiled, but she was also a fragile kid, and it hit her hard. Keeping them apart was a nightmare. We didn't trust her at her friend's house because she'd just slip out at night to see Cillian a few doors down. She clung to this hope they'd end up together someday, and when she hit high school, that's exactly what happened. The second she wasn't a middle schooler anymore, Cillian asked her out. My dad hated him for the pain Serene put herself through chasing him. I didn't like him for stringing her along until she was old enough for his image. But Seren wouldn't hear our warnings, and my mom, foolishly she admits now, encouraged it, hoping them being together would calm things down. It started like most teenage romances do. A happy, carefree honeymoon phase where they were all about each other, and it looked like smooth sailing. But it didn't take long for Cillian's possessive side to creep in, along with some subtle manipulation. Seren's always had guy friends. She's naturally pretty and bubbly, which sometimes ticks off her girlfriends, but guys aren't as petty, so she gravitated toward them. That's where it began. Cillian started getting pissy whenever she hung out with her guy friends, even if he was invited along. Eventually, it was easier for her to ditch them than deal with his attitude, and she lost a lot of those friendships. It escalated to him accusing her of sleeping with the few guy friends she still talked to at school during passing periods, until she had none left. Then it spread to her girlfriends. He didn't like it when they had boyfriends and Serene hung out with them, or when they took her to the movies because she might meet someone. He'd call her friends sluts for how they dressed or acted and told Serene she must be one too if she stuck with them. Their relationship was a mess. You could hear them screaming at each other over the phone when she'd lock herself in her room. Word got around that he'd nearly beat the crap out of guys at school for talking to her. During their frequent breakups, he'd turn vicious, calling her fat, garbage, a slut, whatever he could throw. She said a couple times he'd gotten physical, not hitting her but shoving her against walls and stuff like that. It pissed me off, but I couldn't convince her to dump him. None of us could. When we tried blocking him, they'd just find ways around it. Keeping them apart was damn near impossible without pulling her out of school, which she flat out refused, and they still went to the same one anyway. My dad and I were done with this jerk and told her every chance we got he was bad news. My mom, though, got suckered by him too. She never had a son, and while it's a lousy excuse, I get how she might have had a soft spot for him. We didn't see his crap ourselves, just heard it from Seren and others, so my mom thought Seren was exaggerating, which wasn't out of character since she'd had a lying streak back then. Mom also became kind of an emotional crutch for Cillian, who didn't get along with his own family. Looking back, she admits she was probably just played by him, so this dragged on way longer than it should have. When college prep rolled around, Seren, like a lot of naive kids, based her plans on Cillian. He was heading to a private college on a wrestling scholarship a year ahead of her, and she got accepted to a public university just miles away. All they had to do was make it through her last year of high school, and they'd practically be in college together. That year he was away and she was still in school was a disaster, but it slowly, thankfully, started unraveling their relationship. He'd been hanging out with these two girls at his college who loved picking on Seren, making her paranoid he was messing around behind her back. When she'd call him out, he'd pull the "you know I'd never do that" card. One time sticks out, I was home for the holidays and knocked on her door to chat. She was crumpled on the floor, sobbing. Not bratty tears, but gut-wrenching, clutching her stomach pain. She'd called Cillian, and one of the girls answered, hinting she was in his room late at night. Seren was crushed. We thought that'd be the end, but he spun some bullshit about the girl helping with homework and him being in the bathroom when she picked up. Seren bought it, and they kept going. Stuff with those girls became routine. Things would seem fine. Then they or Cillian would text or post something to make her doubt him. He'd feed her a sob story and she'd take him back. It was like he got off on tormenting her with them, and it was sick. We showed the soccer coach at his school proof of the girls harassing Seren. They were there on scholarships, and he threatened to kick them off the team, which at least stopped them. Around then, Seren dumped Cillian, and for a bit it seemed done. But manipulators don't let go easy. Soon he was begging her back, even dropped out of college and moved back to her hometown to prove he was over those girls. They dated on and off after that, and we had to watch more of his controlling asshole behavior, until she went to college. My parents weren't about to let her skip it just because he bailed, so off she went. Around then, he joined the Marines. I don't know why. His whole teenage life was about keeping Seren close, and shipping off doesn't fit that. But maybe he thought it'd trap her away from us, since my dad and I despised him, and he knew it. Once, Seren asked my dad if he'd bless a marriage to Cillian. Dad said he wouldn't even show up to the wedding. At college, Seren tasted freedom she'd never had. Parties, friends, guys who weren't total jerks. Cillian hated it. His texts and verbal abuse ramped up, but she didn't stop. She visited him once, and I was honestly shocked she came back. I half expected him to propose or hurt her to keep her there. He did propose, but she said she'd wait until his enlistment was up, not wanting to leave her home state. She came back upbeat despite turning him down. They'd had a good time, she said, but it didn't sit right with him. After that, his harassment went off the rails. There's this Marine Ball thing, a big prom-like dance for soldiers, and their dates. Seren wanted to go, but Mom said no. She'd already paid for the earlier trip. Cillian took another woman instead of going solo like a decent guy in love would, and plastered the night all over social media. It broke Seren. That was finally it. They split. He was in California, she was home with us, and we thought it was over. Of course it wasn't. After the breakup, Seren spiraled hard, skipping classes, partying nonstop, burning through her emergency cash. Then something awful happened. I won't dive into the ugly details. It's not my place, even anonymously. And it turns my stomach. But at a party, she was drugged, and you can guess what followed. She hid it from me for years, but Mom knew, and so did Cillian. He'd been hounding her to take him back, and in her wrecked state, she told him, probably hoping for comfort. Instead, he called her a slut, said she asked for it, blamed her, and accused her of lying or wanting it. It shattered her. The one guy she still loved, despite all his shit, threw her trauma in her face and said it was her fault. What kind of man does that? That was the real end. She cut him off for good. The damage was done, though. After the assault and losing him, crappy as he was, she still loved him, but finally saw he was a monster. She dropped out of college, but later got a trade certification and now has a solid life. The stalking didn't stop, though. In retaliation, Cillian married a 19-year-old who looked just like Seren within a month of meeting her, got her pregnant fast, and had a kid within a year, all to spite Seren, and it stung her bad. She'd broken the cycle of abuse, but part of her still cared for that bastard. He even texted her, "I'm gonna name my baby girl after you," or, "I'm gonna name her what we wanted for our kid," just to screw with her head. Psycho. Whatever reaction he wanted, he didn't get it. She blocked him everywhere. She even messaged his wife about his history and stalking. The wife stayed with him, but the harassment paused for a while. It never fully stopped, though. To this day, she gets vile texts from anonymous numbers, calling her awful names, saying she deserved what happened, spewing disgusting crap I won't repeat. She'll send another note to his wife sometimes, but we think he controls her account and deletes them, or she's as nuts as he is and likes tormenting Seren. I doubt that, though. She's probably just another pawn in his sick game. This guy's dangerous. It never got to beatings with Seren, but I'd bet my life if she'd said yes to his proposal, she'd be stuck in California at 19 with a kid, cut off from us, in a verbally and physically abusive hellhole. His anonymous texts are violent, sexual and otherwise. Despite the military's supposed psych checks, he slipped through and now he's trained to kill. I've got no beef with service members. I respect them. But this guy's a threat. Right now he's in California with his wife and kid, obsessively texting Seren filth. His enlistment's up in a year. If he doesn't re-enlist, he'll come back here 5 minutes from my parents. My biggest fear is he'll hurt Seren, or my parents and me to get to her. I've got my own place now. Seren lives with her boyfriend, who's the total opposite of Cillian's psychotic ass. But my parents are still in the same house. I wouldn't put it past him to target them to hurt her. I just hope he re-enlists and never sets foot near us again. Seren just wants to move on. We all do. Mom's long since owned up to enabling them. She was manipulated but takes full blame and feels awful. She told him on one of his last tries to reach us to stay the hell away, and so far he's listened. For now. When he's on leave and back here, I'm terrified I'll go to my parents one day and find something horrible. I'm scared he'll use his marine skills to track Seren and do something awful to her and her boyfriend. She's never gone to the cops about any of this. She hates him now but won't hurt his wife or kids, so she won't report him to the Marines or call the police. She just wants it done and prefers ignoring him. I hope she hits her limit and calls the authorities. But for now, we're all just waiting, bracing for whether he stays in or comes back. Cillian, I doubt you'd hear this and know it's you, but you're a sick fuck. Your jealousy, abuse, stalking, and capacity for violence will land you in jail someday. I just hope it's not for hurting my family. Because if you show up at my parents' house, I won't hesitate to call the cops and defend them and myself. Growing up, I had a pretty great childhood before my parents split. We lived in a big old house with a huge backyard and a brand new in-ground pool. I was the middle daughter, sandwiched between two brothers at the time, so we had your classic suburban family setup. Our street was a mix of different folks, but ours was one of the few houses with a family in it. Next door was an elderly couple with a pack of dogs, and across the street was another older pair who loved pulling pranks on me and my big brother. They were honestly the best. Next to them lived the guy this story's about, Tavish. He was a loner, living by himself, and we only ever saw him walking his dog or taking out the trash, which was odd. Most people on our street knew each other well, but Tavish was a mystery. I barely noticed lights on at his place, and my older brother says he was never really around like the rest of us. It's not like he wasn't home. His sleek Jeep Wrangler was almost always parked in his tiny driveway unless he was at work. One night I was in the dining room with my parents playing some board game. There's a knock at the door. Our neighborhood wasn't rough at all, so my parents usually left the door unlocked until bedtime and never hesitated to answer it. My dad saw it was Tavish and swung the door open, being his friendly self, inviting him in for a beer, even though we'd never really hung out with him before. Tavish sits down, and I remember sitting across from him next to my dad, feeling super shy and awkward because, honestly, this guy always gave me the creeps. He starts telling my parents he knew my mom worked for a home remodeling company. Not weird, since her company car, logo slapped all over it, was always in our driveway. He wanted to know her rates and stuff, so my mom launches into her sales pitch. I got bored of the grown-up talk and bailed to watch my brother play Tony Hawk on his Xbox. Tavish ended up staying maybe an hour, leaving with a handshake and a thanks for the beer, all that jazz. After he left, my mom and dad traded puzzled looks once the door shut. Dad said something about how random it was and that Tavish had a weird vibe, but they both brushed it off as him being a loner with shaky social skills. After that night, my mom started seeing Tavish everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Before, we'd hardly catch a glimpse of him outside his house or with his dog, but now it was a total shift. It wasn't just that thing where you get a new car and suddenly spot it all over. This was a tight-knit small town where you'd recognize folks and say hi even if you weren't close. If my mom had seen him out before, she'd have remembered. It started innocently enough, spotting him at the grocery store, Target, gas stations, or the bank every now and then. But as weeks passed, she noticed something off. Every time she pulled out of our driveway to go somewhere, his red Jeep would peel out right behind her, like he'd been waiting for her to leave. She even saw him once in the parking lot at her work. She knew it was him from the bumper stickers. Things got stranger when he started popping up while she was smoking on our porch or just chilling there with a book. He'd strike up these awkward conversations, the kind where the other person's so socially clumsy it's almost painful, and you just want them to go away. This happened maybe twice a week, and my mom was starting to get seriously sketched out. Her breaking point came one day at the gym. He'd followed her there before. She'd catch him on a machine behind her, staring the whole time. But this time, he showed up 45 minutes into her usual hour-long workout. He got on a machine behind her again, stayed for the last stretch, and when she left, he bailed too, cutting his own session short after just 15 minutes. Not normal. She took a weird roundabout route home to test it, and sure enough, he tailed her the whole way. She'd had it. She came home freaked out and told my dad that the next time he pulled this shit, she'd confront him and scare him off. A few weeks later, it all died down almost completely. My mom started thinking he'd moved on or realized he was being a total creep. Then one night, I woke up late. Must have been midnight, late for a 10-year-old, to grab water from the kitchen. My parents were asleep, and the only light on was a little lamp we kept on the piano in the dining room. To get to the kitchen, I had to pass through there, right by the big bay window facing the street and Tavish's house. As I walked by, I glanced out and saw something I'll never forget. Tavish sitting on our porch in one of our chairs, staring into our house through that huge window. We locked eyes at the same moment. His got massive, and he bolted back across the street to his place. I was so terrified I never told my parents. I know that's dumb, but I was 10 and worried they wouldn't believe me. Or worse, they would. And my dad would go over there and beat the crap out of him. I tried my best to bury it. From then on, he stopped bothering my mom. My parents divorced about 2 years later, and we moved out of that house. He never got his place remodeled either. Even though I don't live there anymore, I hope I never run into Tavish again. So this was a couple of years back when I was in 8th or 9th grade. I had 2 friends I'll call Phalar and Lizara. Lizara had taken a hardcore liking to Phalar, like really intense. She'd damn near attack anyone who so much as brushed against him. I don't know if it was just an obsessive crush or what, but it made everyone in our friend group uncomfortable. Phalar's a sweet guy, so he didn't judge her too harsh, but he'd always grumble about how annoying it was when she got all protective over him. Not even a year after they met, things got seriously weird. Whenever I hung out with them, I'd catch Lysara staring at me if I got too close to Phalar or even touched him. I should mention I was starting to figure out I was a lesbian back then, so I obviously had zero romantic interest in him and wasn't flirting. I told Phalar about it, and he said he was fed up with her acting like that with everyone, even his definitely straight guy friends. So Phalar and I started dodging Lysara, not inviting her to hang out, hoping she'd give up and fade off or something. It was a dumb move, but we were 13 and sucked at serious talks. A few weeks after we started avoiding her, I began getting a ton of emails from shady websites on my school account. Panic-inducing stuff since I used that email for all my schoolwork, like opening presentations. In the end, I had to make a new email and transfer everything over, which was a huge pain in the ass. Nothing happened for a bit, and then I started getting anonymous threats and really messed up messages in my Facebook inbox. It doesn't sound that bad now, but I was 13, and one of them described brutally killing my pets and how to sneak into my backyard. That was creepy as hell. I told Phalar, and he said he'd been getting weird messages too. At first they were love poems, songs, and stories about him. He told the sender to knock it off or he'd call the cops, total bluff, and it stopped for a while. But then it picked up again, this time with threats of self-harm and pics of cuts sent to him. We were both freaked out, but too stupid to Tell our parents because we thought we'd get in trouble somehow. You know how kids are. The online crap kept going for months, getting crazier each time. Fayler and I finally deleted our Facebooks because it was scaring us shitless. After that, it all just stopped. We didn't see Lysara anywhere. Not at school, not at the local parks, which was odd for our small town. One day, Faylar and I planned to hang out after school and walk to his place. I left class to meet him under this tree by the parent pickup zone. As I got close, I saw him talking to someone and slowed down. They were arguing. Faylar's a quiet, chill dude. I'd never heard him yell before, but his ears were red and he was pissed. It was Lysara he was shouting at. She looked different, paler, decked out in baggy, long clothes despite it being 110 degrees out. I heard him yell, "Stop harassing me and my friends, you're fucking insane." Even with him screaming, she had this creepy, forced grin, like a fake photo smile. She said, "We haven't talked in so long. I missed you." I couldn't hear her well and sped up toward Faylar because he looked ready to swing. When I reached them, he looked relieved, said, "Let's just go," and bolted toward his house. I glanced at Lysara before following. She dropped the smile and was glaring at me, her face twisted, highlighting her eye bags and sunken cheeks. She yelled something about my cat, but after seeing that freaky look, I sprinted after Faylar to ask what the hell just happened. He was quiet, staring at his hands and cracking his knuckles. A stress tic. I didn't push it, and we forgot about it once we got to his place. I stayed late playing video games at his house. By the time I headed home, it was around 6 more. The sun was dipping, but it had taken an hour to fully set, and I knew I'd make it back before dark. I got home to an empty house, heated up some food, and crashed. The next morning, I noticed my cat wasn't in my bed. Super weird since she always slept with me. I figured she was downstairs eating, but her dish from last night was untouched. I got this bad feeling I couldn't shake. My parents were either asleep or at work. I made lunch, ate breakfast, and walked 5 minutes to my bus. School was normal, except Faylar seemed off. After algebra, he said he needed to talk after school and told me to meet at the tree again. I was weirded out, but agreed. I also asked if he'd seen my cat. She wandered the neighborhood sometimes, but he went pale and shrugged it off. I was annoyed he didn't take it seriously and went to class. School ended, and I met him. He said he knew where my cat was. I was pissed by then. I'd asked him straight up earlier and he dodged it, but I just wanted to know about my cat. I asked where she was, and he looked uneasy. He pulled out his iPod Touch and showed me a gory pic of a chopped-off cat tail with a bloody note and her collar tag. I started crying. He said he'd found it at his back door, and the note rambled about him cheating on someone and this being their revenge. He apologized and said more, but I zoned out. I snapped back when he mentioned Lysara, saying she must have done it. He explained their argument. She'd claimed she was his girlfriend and was going to get back at me. I remembered her yelling about my cat that day at his place. We were both creeped out. We went to my house that day. Couldn't stop peeking out the window for Lysara. After a week, we noticed she was gone. No one had seen her at school or around town. We asked around, and most said they'd noticed she wasn't there, except this girl I barely knew. She said Lysara had moved to another state, pissed about it, but didn't know why. That cut all ties between me and Lysara. I never saw her again. But Faylar kept getting unsigned love letters for another year. We drifted apart after that, so I don't know if they kept coming. All I know is, Lysara, if you're still out there where I am, watch out, because I'm coming for you. I'm going to do my best to keep my hometown anonymous since this happened in a pretty small place, but I'll make sure to include all the key details. When I was 15, I got my first real job, not babysitting, at a local restaurant. I worked there until I was about 7. One of the assistant managers was a close family friend, basically a second mom to me, and she always looked out for me. The restaurant had a rep for being kind of a dive, but it drew a decent crowd, all locals, regulars and out-of-towners, so we were busy most nights. I had my fair share of run-ins with creepy old guys hitting on me over the years. Usually they were tourists just passing through, but there were a few regulars I learned to steer clear of. This story isn't about them, though. It's about one of my co-workers. If you've ever worked in the service industry, you know supervisors don't always hire the cream of the crop for back-of-house jobs, food prep, dishwashing, that kind of thing. They're often folks with rough pasts who'll work cheap so they get the gig. The restaurant I was at didn't usually run background checks, so the back was full of pervy, middle-aged stoners who'd make me uncomfortable from time to time. I got used to dealing with it, though. The last summer I worked there, they hired a guy named Redian. I'm only 5'2", and when he started, I was 16. Redian was about 6'7", all muscle, with a face that screamed trouble, the kind you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. He was probably mid-30s, but drugs had aged him fast. Word was he'd had a bad history with substances, obvious from how strung out he always looked, and he'd been in some underground MMA ring before landing this job. The second I saw him, I knew he wasn't someone I wanted to get to know. A few weeks in, things predictably got weird with him. Keep in mind I was one of the only women there under 30, and the waitressing pants I had to wear hugged my figure, prime bait for the lonely druggies in the back. Redian followed their lead. It started with stares when I'd walk by. Long, menacing ones, not the usual quick glances I'd get. Then he'd follow me into back rooms, just standing there staring, not saying a word, but flashing this creepy smirk when I'd turn and catch him. That went on for about a month until he got bolder. He'd come up behind me when I was alone, whisper filthy shit in my ear, and laugh when I'd tell him to screw off and leave me alone. And yeah, I told my manager, but the only one who took me serious was my family friend who'd hired me, and she didn't oversee the back crew. They didn't have to listen to her, and the manager who did run them was one of the creeps harassing me too. That guy even gave me a nickname about my ass, gross as hell, but it comes up later, so I was stuck. I needed the job and the cash. I've got 7 siblings and wanted to pull my own weight, and it was the only place close enough for my parents to drive me to before I could drive myself. As months went on, Redian got more obsessed. Guy friends I worked with told me he was always asking personal stuff about me, where I went to school, if I had a boyfriend, even where my house was since he knew I lived nearby. He'd ask what I was doing after work too. Once I found my bag with my change of clothes had been rummaged through. The only thing missing was a bra I'd planned to wear out that night. I can only guess it was Redian. My breaking point came when he groped me while I was reaching for a high shelf. I broke down crying and ran to my best friend there, Soren, who agreed it was enough. I was like everyone's little sister at that place. Most of the older servers and hosts kept me away from the creeps, and if anyone messed with me, they'd step in. Soren chewed Redian out and told him to back off. From then on, I wouldn't go to the back without Soren or another guy. With me. That's what finally made Redian lose interest, or so I thought. Here's what really made me fear him, though. A few weeks before I quit, I was on the closing shift with Soren, my family friend manager, a few others, and Redian. That manager's the sweetest woman alive, always seeing the best in people. She'd been slipping Redian small cash for the bus, she said, but that night she told him she had to stop. She knew he was likely buying drugs and it could cost her job. Redian lost it. He started screaming, towering over her, calling her vile names, throwing papers and whatever else he could grab off her desk. I was in the next room, heard the chaos, and walked out just as he flung her office door open in a rage. He glared at me with pure hate and snarled that if I told anyone what I saw, I'd regret it. He was clearly high, but his violence and tone scared the living shit out of me. I went into the office. My manager was sobbing, begging me not to. Leave her alone with him. I stayed, and she drove me home, thanking me for being there at the right moment. That's when I knew how unhinged and dangerous he was. I quit once I got my driver's license and could work elsewhere, about 5 months after Ridian started. I got a barista job at a local cafe and worked there almost 2 months, barely thinking about that old place or creepy Ridian. Then, one night I was heading into my shift at 6 p.m. It was late December, pitch dark already. The cafe was in a strip with other stores, but the parking lot was dimly lit, and it was raining, making it extra eerie. As I walked from my car, I saw a figure under the single street light near my job's end of the building. I froze. I'd recognize that silhouette anywhere. It was Ridian, just standing there in the path from the lot to the door, facing me. He saw me too. I could make out that disgusting smirk even in the faint light. He didn't have a license. Last I knew, always bumming rides or taking the bus from the restaurant, so I don't know how he got there. My job was at the strip's end. Past it was just dumpsters, so him being there with no reason to go in was weird as hell. My mind raced as I stood there, staring at this guy who'd tormented me for months and threatened me too. I got anxious, but tried acting like I didn't know him. As I passed, he said, "I finally found you again." I sprinted the last few feet into the cafe, bolted to the bathroom, and had an anxiety attack. I called Soren for the first time in months and spilled everything. Since then, he's popped into my work off and on. Every time I get flustered and find excuses to duck out, asking for me or winking from across the lobby. I told my current manager about my history with him. He's easy to spot. So now whenever he shows, she sends me to the back. I'm so grateful to work somewhere that actually gives a damn about me and doesn't put up with harassment or assault like I dealt with at 16. I hate that I went through that so young, but it forced me to grow up fast and learn to stand up for myself. I just want other young women to know if someone's treating you like this, you don't have to take it. Get out, do what's best for you. Nothing's worth living in fear. You're worth more than that. I made the dumbest, most damaging decision of my life last year. I'm a girl, and at the time I was 16, struggling with painfully low self-esteem. Last year was brutal for me. I craved attention desperately. I didn't grow up with a real father figure, and my relationship with my mom was a constant power struggle. That tension sparked me lashing out and doing incredibly stupid shit. The worst of my choices hit during Christmas break. I just quit my waitressing gig at a local diner and was stuck at home grounded. Technically, I was only banned from leaving the house, but I chose to hole up in my room for days. To pass the time, I'd mess around on social media, mostly Twitter. But I also hopped on dating apps to kill the boredom. Tinder was easily the most entertaining. I'll admit I lied about my age to get on the app, though I made it clear in my bio that I was only 16. I was super picky, swiping right on maybe 1 out of every 20 guys. I didn't put much thought into the ones I picked. Some messaged me, some didn't. I had a bunch of short, pointless conversations that went nowhere. That is, until I matched with this guy named Torin. He said he was around 25, and honestly, he was pretty attractive. He hit me with a cheesy pickup line, and we flirted back and forth for a bit. Eventually, he asked for my number, and of course, I didn't hesitate to give it to him. We texted all night. Nothing deep, just casual stuff. His spelling was atrocious and his grammar was a mess, but I actually found it kind of cute. It was around 3 a.m. when I finally crashed, leaving him and everyone else I'd been chatting with hanging. It was so late I figured they'd get it and assume I'd fallen asleep. I was wrong. When I woke up around 11 a.m., my phone was a disaster. 12 missed calls, 3 or 4 voicemails, and about 10 texts, all from Torin. He'd seemed like a chill, decent guy over text, but that illusion shattered when I read his messages and listened to his voicemails. I'd never heard or seen such vile, threatening language in my life, and it came out of nowhere. He said a ton of awful stuff, but I'll share the worst of it. His last text read, "Okay, cunt, since you want to ignore me like a bitch, then I'll treat you like one. When I see you, I'll show you how much I hate being ignored. Ever had a broken jaw? It hurts and I can't wait to shove myself in your bloody mouth, you vile slut." Excuse the spelling and grammar, that screenshot was a mess. Like I said, he sucked at both. I blocked him instantly, didn't even bother replying. I deleted the texts and voicemails and tried to shove the whole thing out of my mind. I didn't tell anyone, especially not my mom. She'd have taken my phone for sure. 2 days went by and nothing changed. I was still locked in the house, rotting in my room like a bedbum. It was late, everyone else was asleep, and I was bored out of my skull. I started thinking about the whole Torin mess when it hit me like a lightning bolt. I'd blocked him everywhere except the app where we met. Tinder. I'd turned off notifications for it, so it had totally slipped my mind. I logged back in, and sure enough, my inbox was flooded with messages from him. I wasn't even going to open them, but the first few words of one threat caught my eye. He was saying he knew where I lived, claiming he was standing outside my house. He even mentioned the house being 2 stories. That could have been a lucky guess. Plenty of houses are 2 stories. But what turned my stomach into knots was his location. When we first matched, he was 30 miles away. Now, it said he was less than a mile from me. I lost my shit, deleted him, and my entire Tinder account. Right then and there. I regret that now. I didn't think to screenshot anything for proof. I was too dumb and terrified to tell anyone. That night I kept peeking out my window and even let one of our outdoor blue heelers sleep in my room. I was scared to the point of feeling sick, stayed awake until dawn, and didn't crash until around 3 p.m. When I finally dragged myself downstairs, my mom hit me with news that chilled me to the bone. She said a man had come to the door asking for me, claiming he knew me from church. I hadn't even been to church in forever. Thank God my mom's sharp. She told him he had the wrong house, then called the police and gave them a description. She didn't wake me up because she figured it was just some random creep and that I didn't know him. She mentioned he asked for her daughter instead of using my name. If it was Torin, I have no clue how he tracked me down, and I still don't. That month dragged on forever before I finally moved in with my older sister. The only hint of Torin I might have seen was an old, junky green car that kept cruising down our street. It probably wasn't him, but my nerves screamed otherwise. This whole ordeal still haunts my dreams, and I haven't touched Tinder since. To all you girls out there, and guys too, please be careful on social media and dating apps. You never really know who's on the other side of the screen. My name's Elton, and I've spent seriously a ton of time camping, hiking, and hunting. I've run into all sorts of predators and found myself in some hairy situations. Everything from a tornado barreling my way to being shadowed by bears. So I don't spook easily. This past July, I was out camping near my family's farm in western Iowa with my girlfriend, Mara, my best friend, Kale, and his new girlfriend, Linnea. Linnea had never been camping before, let alone wandered more than a mile off a trail into the thick of a forest. She was understandably on edge, but we kept an eye out for her. In that part of the state, you've got to watch for prairie rattlers, poison ivy, and even mountain lions. We set up camp in a clearing on a small hill, surrounded by a few trees but deep in the woods, no doubt about it. We got there, made camp, ate, drank, and crashed by midnight. No one had any injuries beyond a few mosquito bites. Everything was going smooth as planned until I jolted awake to Linnea screaming her damn lungs out. I couldn't believe how loud she was. It was unreal. I shot up, guessing Mara woke up at the same time, grabbed my flashlight and my Glock and bolted outside. I told Mara to stay in our tent just in case. Kyle was already trying to calm Linnea down, and she was rambling, almost babbling about something huge stomping through the camp, scratching at the tent and making a god-awful noise. I told her it might have been a coyote or even a mountain lion. We'd stashed what little food and trash we had outside the camp area, so that wasn't the problem. I reassured her I'd stay up, relight the fire, and take turns with Kale keeping watch. Our movement and the flames should scare off anything lurking. That seemed to settle her, and she actually went to sleep in Mara's tent. Kale and I stayed awake, talking quietly, tending the fire and checking around camp for tracks or signs. We didn't spot anything obviously off or suspicious. It could have been a mountain lion, and that had me on edge with the girls there. About 30 minutes later, Kyle stepped just beyond the firelight to take a piss. He was off to my left, my tent across the fire in front of me, Kale's tent behind me. Then, off to my empty right, I saw something and heard a loud crunch. Kale heard it too. He was practically still yanking up his pants as he sprinted back toward the fire. "What the hell was that? That's big," he said. "I know. Could be a big cat. Better grab your .44 from your bag and that bright tack light," I told him. He came back with both, and we waited, ready to shine the light wherever we heard more movement. Then came another crunch and a snap, this time almost right behind us. We jumped up, spun around together, and flicked on the brightest light. For a split second, we caught sight of what looked like a gorilla-sized, gorilla-shaped figure vanishing back into the trees. At that point, I'm trying to hold it together while Kale's just frozen. I snapped at him to pull himself together. We needed to build the fire bigger. Once it was roaring, we each took a post, one in front of the tent, one behind to guard the girls. For the rest of the night, we heard this awful grumbling, growling sound. I've never heard anything like it. Loud crunching and snapping kept coming from the woods behind Kale's tent, and really all around us off and on. Every now and then we'd catch something moving to our left or right in the clearing, just beyond the trees. I kept the fire blazing. By the end of the night, it was damn near enormous. As soon as the sun started creeping up, we packed up fast. On our way out, we spotted big prints in the mud down by a little stream at the base of the hill we'd camped on. All I can say is they looked like a huge man's footprints. Whatever we saw, it sure as hell wasn't a man. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it meant to hurt us. I don't know if it was Bigfoot. Frankly, I don't want to know. The way I see it, it doesn't really matter. I thought it was a mountain lion at first, and those are dangerous too. I'm not letting this stop me from camping. Sometimes you just hear scary shit in the woods at night because scary shit lives out there. Guess that's just part of the adventure.